Hello there and welcome to the 209th edition of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show where, unsurprisingly, we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. This Direct will be slightly different because at the time of taping, we are waiting to see the Nintendo Switch 2. And by the time this show goes out, we will have seen it, so there will be an insert. And yes, joining me to discuss everything, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie, hello.
Yes, Rich, I'm very excited to hear everything you have to report back from the London Switch 2 showcase. But in the interim, I think we have a pretty good show.
Yep, absolutely. And hello, Alex Battaglia.
Yep, I'm not at that Switch 2 showcase because I don't live in the UK. But I would be there otherwise. Everyone knows that. But yeah, a lot of other stuff. I'm covering a game demo this Direct, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Okay, well, I think we should just get on with it. But before that, of course, shout out to store.digitalfoundry.net, the home of our merchandising wares. Do check that out to support the team. But with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, our lead news story this week, and it is actually being taped out of sequence, and that is our hands-on experience with a Nintendo Switch 2, specifically Cyberpunk 2077. So this one, well, what can I say? There was a London event where the press could go hands-on, and then it was followed by the public. And we've got a big report on that coming. Tom and I went to see that. But obviously, we wanted to pick out something for this Direct. And it was our experience with Cyberpunk 2077. Now, all that we know at this point is what we've seen from the footage in the Nintendo Direct, which seemed to have a combination of like maybe one or two handheld shots and the rest of it was docked. And otherwise, the impressions of other media who've seen it. And it's fair to say that the impressions have been mixed. So where should we begin here? I think we need to tackle something that the PRs on site were looking to get clarification on and looking to get the message out there. There's this story that's going around which seems to be a misinterpretation where they were saying that what we were seeing was the product of a port that took 7 weeks to create. And that's not the case, right? It kind of doesn't really make sense if you put any kind of thought into it. But the story is really that the code that we saw, the demo code that we saw, is 7 weeks old. So that's a fair bit of time, obviously from the present day, but also until the game releases alongside the Switch 2 at launch. So everything that we're going to be talking about here is very much work in progress, and you'll see at the top of the footage there that they had basically warnings to that effect. This isn't representative of the final product. It's representative of what we saw, essentially. And let's kick off with talking about the docked experience. Now, this is interesting because you had one save game on the system in order to skip all of the various character intros. And that save game was basically right in the middle of Dogtown from the Phantom Liberty. And Oliver, you know as well as I do that in terms of the load on the system compared to standard Cyberpunk content, this was content from an area of the game that was never ported to the last generation of consoles. And that was for a reason. It was just a lot more demanding. And I'm curious what you make of this before I chime in with my impressions. But, first impressions are kind of okay when you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of looking through this footage, it's kind of similar to last-gen consoles, or what you would expect, I think, out of last-gen consoles in this particular area in terms of its overall kind of visual look in still frames there. You got screen space reflections, you got good draw distance, acceptable shadow map quality, the car headlamps on the player car, they're shadow casting, quite nice there.
Yeah.
And that's all stuff that's like not really exceptional, but it's stuff you'd never see on Switch 1, really, especially in combination there. You're getting all those features that looks, suitably last gen level. And that's actually pretty cool for, a Nintendo console to actually be at that level of visual fidelity. We certainly have not seen that before. I guess the other area where we do need to make some remarks here is on performance. And that was more mixed. Like in some shots, some areas, it was running pretty okay there. But when we were doing like the more intense performance testing here, when you go down that Dogtown strip in a car at fast speeds or on a motorcycle at fast speeds, performance can tank pretty hard. It looks like it's getting well below 30 FPS in those instances. And then in big firefights, it can be kind of a bit of a problem there as well. But here, this is really curious because it's a really demanding area of the game. Even on current gen consoles, this is an area that can regularly dip pretty hard, go into the 50s on Series X, Series S, PS5. In performance mode, it can get hit pretty hard, harder than you'd see in the base game, even in certain market areas in the base game that are also quite demanding. This is one of the more demanding areas. So it's interesting and kind of impressive on some level that this is the area of the game they're choosing to demo predominantly. But yeah, it does seem to be kind of a mixed outcome here, where I think on the visual side, we're getting some nice looking graphics that are, in that PS4-ish ballpark. But in terms of performance, we're seeing code that's clearly a work in progress, let's say.
Yeah, I'd go on with that. From the hands-on experience, one thing which the footage can't really show, but it was for HDR10, which was pretty fantastic. Interestingly, you could turn it off. There was two options in the menu there. There was the ability to have HDR10 on and off, and then there was the performance and the quality mode. But the nature of the content was already so variable in performance that I'm going to level with you. I couldn't really tell that much of a difference. So yeah, jury's out on that one. I honestly think maybe they should just concentrate on getting the 30 FPS quality mode right and performing well, as opposed to sort of like trying to produce a 40 FPS performance mode. Something that is quite interesting, though, is that the screen, when you're making the selections, is saying that quality mode targets 1440p and performance mode targets 1080p, but that just seem to be like a remnant from whatever
maybe
version.
Series S has those selections.
Yes.
Yeah.
that was what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yes, but so I couldn't really tell the difference between quality and performance, and there were performance issues. Yes, it seems to be that the game is both CPU and GPU limited, I would say, because when there's a lot of entities in firefights and when you're traveling at speed across the environment there, you are seeing performance drops, which is indicative of kind of what we saw almost on PlayStation 4 in a way, and Xbox One consoles. So I think there's work to be done there. What else can I say about the docked mode? Yes. Obviously, in the Nintendo Direct footage, when you kind of emerge from the Dogtown black market into that area here, you can see that performance dropped to 23 frames per second. And you'll note, Oliver, in the footage I said that I actually went to that area and did a slow pan left-right to kind of show potential performance problems there. So there wasn't really any that I could tell. It seemed to be pretty consistent. So the build may well be different to the one that was in the Nintendo Direct, or it may well be the case that just the lighting conditions, time of day, game conditions may well have been different there. But even so, and I should say that in the black market itself, there was still variable performance. I think it was quite brave of CD Projekt Red to actually provide that as the save game location. If I was CD Projekt Red, I would have just stuck you at some area of the original game. Which brings us on to the handheld footage, because I did actually play a bit of the beginning of the original game there. Admittedly, most of it is in indoor areas, which are less taxing on performance. In Phantom Liberty, when we went on a mission, there was a firefight in indoor conditions that when I was playing docked that actually seemed to play okay. But handheld, the original Cyberpunk, just sort of going through some of the areas at the beginning of the game, they actually seem to run fine. So I think there may well be a divide between original content and Phantom Liberty content. Can't really say, because obviously the game's still early in development. Handheld experience, though, interesting. Again, I went into a sort of open world firefight and performance dived. Again, I think it's similar to the kind of issues that we saw with the last gen versions, in a way that you seem to be hitting a CPU limit there. But one thing I will say, which you can't really show in this footage, it's the HDR. Now, the quality of the screen on Switch 2 is great, but I'd say it's not OLED class by any means. However, the aesthetic of Cyberpunk with those neon lights, it really seemed to pop on the mobile screen. I thought that looked really, really great. And it does seem to run well in some scenarios, that, based on what we've both seen from that footage. So if we're talking about a basis from which CD Projekt Red are working from towards the final product, I'm slightly concerned that it's a launch product, and there's not a long time until we get to launch. But at the same time, as an early work in progress, dated code already, there's grounds for optimism, I think, here. But I do think maybe we do need to be cognizant of the fact that this is Cyberpunk 2077. It's the benchmark game almost, and the concept that they're going to be running this on a handheld that seems to cap at 10 watts. The concept that we're seeing anything playable at all here, I think, is quite remarkable, even in this early form.
Yeah. And I'd also suggest here that I think with CDPR, with The Witcher 3, and with the original launch version of Cyberpunk 2077, we're kind of used to their games launching with pretty big performance issues on consoles. And this is code that's like already 7 weeks old, almost 2 months old, and we've got about 2 months until launch. There's some room, I'm sure, for optimization and improvement here, and I would hopefully expect this to improve substantially. But yeah, in some of those areas, in Dogtown in particular, you're engaging in like this massive firefight with, I think, more enemies than I've seen in the base game for sure. So it just seems brutal. I'm seeing like, probably 12 little red dots, 15 red dots on the player HUD there. That seems like a pretty intense load. But yeah, in general, this is just like the worst of all stress tests. I think Alex also observed that on PC, this open world Dogtown area is really tough to run. But I think on that display topic there, going through this footage, I think that it's a little bit hard to see exactly how good those highlights look in this footage, just because of the fact that the camera's dynamic range is maybe not a huge amount of dynamic range. But certainly we are seeing, as we suggested in last week's Direct, we are seeing a little bit of that raised black level in dark content, kind of like an IPS glow, or in this case, an LTPS glow possibly, where we're getting that contrast level is not 100% perfect like we would see on an OLED. And I think in general, you'd probably suggest that, a good OLED display, especially a good OLED display with high quality HDR like the Steam Deck OLED, is a fair shot better than what we're seeing here, even if this is a pretty good display, all things considered.
Yeah. A couple of other sort of housekeeping points. DLSS, everybody's talking about it with regards to Cyberpunk, and we're going to kind of talk about it a bit later with another topic that we've recorded a bit further on down the line. It was a sort of non-committal response from CDPR. I kind of will get back to you, because there's been various reports that it's in there, that it isn't in there, and I didn't get any kind of indication on site by looking at it or by speaking to the PR that we know one way or the other. But there is an interesting thing that I'd like to raise. A couple of things. First of all, when I went to see the game, something was wrong with it. And it turned out, for example, the quality mode was running at 60 frames per second, and it looked awful. And it turned out that the displays had been reset, and they were basically on like storefront settings, and you know how bad they are, over sharpened, motion smoothing on, which is why, Tom was looking at it and thought, what's going on here? Surely they're not doing frame gen. And I guess it was frame gen in a way, but from the display. So, basically the alarm was raised with Nintendo, and they came along and reset the displays, and everything started to make sense there. Second thing we're going to be talking about later is kind of like some simulations of the kind of GPU power that Switch 2 has got to work with in mobile mode, because it's kind of like the big unknown. And we use Cyberpunk as an example there. And I think you'll see some quite stark differences from my projections to what we're seeing here. And I think it's simply because I was targeting 30 FPS with DLSS no matter what. So, the resolution range for the DRS, the dynamic resolution, was like 50 to 100%. And like 50% at 7, and I was targeting 720p. So 50% would be upscaled 360p. which doesn't look great in some scenarios when it does go down that far. Obviously, I don't think the DRS range is that high based on the demo that we saw, because the quality of the footage was generally quite good. Image quality, I thought, was generally quite good. So there may well be some changes there in terms of how they tackle dynamic resolution, or maybe not. Maybe they'll just have to stick with the variable performance, or they can actually optimize. And obviously the stuff that we're doing later on in that segment will effectively have no CPU limitation.
Exactly.
And I think there is a CPU limitation on Switch 2. But overall, I mean, early work, promising in many regards, obvious sort of hurdles to overcome. But, this is CD Projekt Red. They've not farmed it out to an external developer. They're doing it themselves. So I'd say there's grounds for optimism here, but also I guess we need to be kind of realistic that this is a power-constrained device by design. And the game was never designed for this level of hardware. It was designed for something quite different. So they've essentially had to, bring over what they've done already to Switch 2. Mm-hmm. They can't design for the device in the same way that Nintendo can. But that's it. That's my impressions. Final thoughts, Oliver?
I think overall this is it's a good effort insofar as it shows that the visual target is comfortably, I think, in that last generation range. It's just the performance level that we're seeing at the moment is not quite up to that standard necessarily of where we want it to be. But, in the fullness of time, I would expect this will probably improve by a good margin. And hopefully by launch, we'll have a good playable 30 FPS experience. If not, maybe 40 FPS is a bit too ambitious, especially in Dogtown and some of these more challenging areas. Some of these areas they didn't even attempt to bring to last generation consoles. But overall, I think it's a decent starting point for what is surely to be one of the most exciting ports in the system, for sure, in its early days.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Right, and with that, let's move back to our previously taped show. Okay, then, so moving on, we're going to be talking about the Metal Eden demo. Alex, you've taken a look at this on PC. This one's attracted a lot of attention because it's basically, pure, unrefined Unreal Engine 5. Looks really good. You've played it. Tell us more.
Well, the game is pretty cool. As you're looking at this B-roll of me playing on PC here. I only checked out the demo on PC, but as far as I know, it's also out on PlayStation at the moment. So PS5, PS5 Pro. And the game is pretty cool. It is a mix of, I would say, Shadow Warrior, the more recent ones, not the old one, Doom 2016, because it's arena-based gameplay, as well as that Cyborg Ninja game that we covered on the channel that I forget the name of, it's like Cyberpunk ninja game where you run through levels and stuff.
Ghost Runner, thank you.
Yes. It's like a mix of all those things, but Ghost Runner, it's more about the traversal than in this game. I'd say this game is more combat focused, because there's different weapons and whatnot, whereas in Ghost Runner, it's more about getting through the levels with style. And it's pretty cool. And the art design is really well done. Kind of has that mecha anime aesthetic to it, pushing a lot of post-processing that we'll talk about in a minute, and really well done hard surface modeling. So you just going through the environments, everything looks really pristine, really good looking game, actually, I would say. And it sticks to its aesthetic extremely well. That's one thing I noticed throughout the entire demo. It doesn't really seem to have any faults in those aspects. And I was enjoying my time with it. Really, I thought the combat was good fun too. But it was an Unreal Engine 5 game, and I'm playing it on PC here. I was playing it on a Ryzen 7 9800X3D. And I had a 4070 Super in there, mainly because I was doing some DLSS coverage, and I just had that GPU in at the time. For that, I was originally targeting 4K DLSS. I was like, no, that's too high. So I bumped the game down to just 1440p in quality or balance mode, depending upon what I was playing. And I was not at all GPU limited, essentially, during the entire play. But still, I noticed a lot of Unreal Engine 5 issues. Some of them specific to this title, but some things you're pretty used to seeing, actually. The game is, as far as the EXE describes, shipping on Unreal Engine 5.3.1. And there wasn't any very large, visible, dedicated shader pre-compilation step. It could be using the asynchronous compilation that was enabled, I think, in like 5.2-ish, 5.3-ish. But going through the game, like you can see here, this video, just even the first 25 minutes, collected all the hitches that you can see there. Once again, not at all GPU limited. And they kind of happen when you're like going through and traversing stuff, or sometimes you can see like an enemy spawn and it occurs, or like the first time I do a melee attack against someone, the first time I do like an air dash, presumably because some effect spawns when you do an air dash. So the game seems to have a combination of presumably traversal stutters and shader compilation stutter. Not really nearly as bad as I've seen in other Unreal Engine 5 titles, but it's pretty disappointing to see in the first like 20 minutes of a game. And like the first cool things you do, like the first time you punch a dude, that happens, it's like, oh, this kind of sucks. And that was not very nice to see. These were like sometimes in excess of like 50, 66 milliseconds on a 9800 X3D. So as your CPU is less powerful potentially than that, which a lot of them are, those will be longer and they'll be more obvious. And the ones that I show here that only like bridge 16 milliseconds going in between 60 and 33 because I have VSync on, well, those will be then larger as well, probably within the 40 millisecond range on a lot of CPUs. So that's not cool to see. Another thing that I noticed was this game uses Software Lumen, and so when Software Lumen was developed, it's they really originally showed it off there in that Lumen in the Land of Nanite or whatever demo, and that was just like rolling hills, rocky formations, not a lot of hard lines, and the obscured areas were, there wasn't a lot of also direct reflections. Mainly just that like little puddle of water they had. And that's what it was kind of designed around, like rolling hills and very diffuse materials. Because as soon as the game starts having a lot of reflections that you can see full screen, as well as when there's like more complex obstruction, and as well as when you use a lot of emissive lighting, Software Lumen breaks down heavily. And that's the reason why the Matrix Awakens demo, for example, did not use Software Lumen, because as I showed off in a video in the past, the game's visuals completely fall apart. That demo's visuals completely fall apart with Software Lumen. It's just not meant for these type of materials and environments. And unfortunately, this one's using it in a heavily sci-fi, heavily reflective environment with tons of little emissive strips everywhere. So like anywhere you look, as you can see here on the ground, there's just tons of boiling of the lighting just going shimmering. Some of this comes down to the denoising. Lumen's denoiser is cheap and not very good, but some of it just really does come down, as we've seen in games before, that allow you to switch between hardware and Software Lumen, just to the fact that Hardware Lumen is so much better at doing a lot of things. And you're moving really quickly through the game, so it isn't always super distracting, but in the few moments when you get the breath of like fresh air where you can explore a little bit because you want to pick something up or just look at the cool environments, that's when you start to notice it. And it does bring down the otherwise really incredible art in the game. And the funny thing about this is that I was about to say Twitter, on Blue Sky, I wrote out a message there saying like, this sucks. The game looks great and it's being kind of ruined by Software Lumen. And then I got a message on Discord from someone, and then I got a message from the developers saying like, hey, what do you think? And I wrote them actually a pretty long email about what I think. So maybe things will change in that direction. I wrote in the email, I wrote to them like, it's easy and hard to implement like Hardware Lumen. And I said like why it's easy and the harder parts of it. And then I said, maybe, what do you think about that? I have yet to get a response, but maybe when this game does come out, and I mentioned PS5 Pro as well, there could be maybe an optional Hardware Lumen mode, which could maybe fix some of these issues. But regarding the hitches that I saw in the demo, I have no idea if that'll be different on release. And I think release is in like 4 weeks or so.
Right. Okay. That's a bit disappointing. I'm just enjoying the concept of I'm just picturing the blank email with subject line, what I think, W-O-T.
With
In block
W-O-T,
capitals.
what I think. Yeah.
My question to you, Alex, you were saying that it can be easy and it can be difficult to have hardware lumen. Well, first of all, why? I thought it was just a switch that you pulled in Unreal Engine 5 and insta hardware lumen.
It is insta hardware lumen in the fact that you export your project with it. And then I recommended like making it default off and then have it turn on for the user if they select an option in the menu. That's the easy part. Like just you'd have to hook up a UI element to it. That's a little bit harder. But the harder part would be replaying the game to make sure that hardware lumen isn't breaking some sort of visual aspect of the game that you had previously only tested in software mode. For example, like maybe an area is now a lot brighter because the emissive lighting is much more accurate, right? Maybe you didn't want that. Or maybe hardware lumen is showing something in the distance that you don't want to see in a reflection, right? So I basically said you'd have to QA that. And then the other aspect of is technically hardware lumen is going to use a separate grouping of shaders that will react with your materials differently. And so you have another like shader permutation explosion as a result of that. So if you were to play the game without it having had shader pre-compilation enabled for hardware lumen being enabled, then what would happen is you can maybe see a lot of extra hitches and stutters that would have not been there had hardware lumen not been implemented. So I said like you would have to do like a second, depending upon how they were collecting PSOs, like they would have to maybe do a second collection pass if they're using the bundle PSO system, or they would maybe have to do something else to make sure that the game doesn't have extra hitches on top of what it already has. So that's why I said like, that's the hard part. And I don't expect anything. But I just sent off the email saying like, hey, this is what I think. And yeah, I mean, otherwise, I loved this demo. I thought it was really cool. The visuals are super excellent. The gameplay is very fast. Maybe could have been a touch louder in terms of how the guns felt. But I really liked it. But it had some other issues too. Like there was no ability in the menu beyond turning post-processing to low to turn off motion blur. And I don't think that's reasonable. I think a lot of people will want to turn off motion blur, so they need a separate slider for that, which should be pretty easy. And also the X-axis on the mouse. I have heard that the controller is possibly worse, but like there's incredible acceleration on the mouse's X-axis. So like you flip like insanely quickly. I was using like a 3200 DPI mouse, I believe it was, or 3000. I forget what his number exactly it is. Very high it can be. And I would just move it like not even a centimeter and I'd be like 360ing. It was ridiculous. So the game doesn't require precision necessarily, but I don't think a default like positive acceleration curve on a mouse is ever good. So they should probably fix that too. Okay.
Well, the demo is out on PS5, so I might check that out actually.
Yeah, give it a check. It's it was a little heavy on the GPU in some areas, but that was 4070 Super, and I purposely made myself more GPU, less GPU limited with my settings. So I'd be very curious to see what exactly it's doing there on base PS5, for example. They allow you to turn off lumen reflections and just use SSR. So maybe that's what they're doing on PS5. I really noted yet though.
Okay, cool. Any thoughts, Oliver?
No, I think this actually looks pretty great. All the performance issues aside and the lumen issues aside, I think this game is really cool. And the Unreal issues certainly here are unfortunate a little bit. And it's unfortunate, I think, especially because this is probably one of the most exciting FPS games I've seen recently, like along with the new Doom game that's out next month and Painkiller, which I think is out in October or November this year. They're both very, very exciting games, all three very, very exciting games that are coming out in 2025. And going through Alex's gameplay, this looks right up my alley. Absent those issues, hopefully whatever stuttering problems there are hopefully not as much of an issue on PlayStation, perhaps, possibly there. And then, those lumen issues are kind of, it's always fun with software lumen kind of poking around and seeing some of the issues. And here you are seeing more issues than I think you'd see in a title like RoboCop, for instance, where you have a bit more of the naturalistic kind of environments. Not everything is shiny. There's not a ton of specular everywhere. And you do see some lumen breakup and some inaccuracies. And also just kind of like that fundamental mismatch of like this complicated, very angular Euclidean geometry everywhere and these kind of blobby SDFs. It just kind of look weird. Mixed, it's a better mix for like rolling hills, like Alex said, or in some games, right? More naturalistic environments, I feel like, at least, not so much for this kind of stuff.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at your hitching video that you've put together, Alex. It's pretty grim. I guess at least the PlayStation version won't have most of that.
Yeah, at least to the ones that presumably are down to shadowy compilation.
Yeah.
I didn't play the game twice over. Like, come on, I can't do that for every single darn game. I'm not a QA. But yeah, I presume those. But the traversal ones, I'd be curious to see if they are also there on PS.
I'm also interested. At some point, we're going to have to do a CPU test, which is just stutter testing, to actually see the scaling of stutter across like Intel, AMD. Because it is all a CPU thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and also there could technically be differences between the IHVs. I've never measured that, but if the shader compiler is slower on Intel versus AMD or Nvidia, then you could technically see longer stutters lengths. I mean, they're already annoying anyways, but they could be even more annoying, right? So that'd be funny.
Okay. I think we'll need to look at this one in due course. I think the timing of the release up against Doom or close to it is slightly unfortunate, but hopefully it will find an audience and we'll check it out. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so we missed this last week because, we were obsessively talking about Switch 2. But Asus did put out a teaser suggesting that they are indeed putting out an Xbox handheld at some point in the future. Indications suggest it is going to be happening in 2025. And there were some mild hints about the kind of things that we should expect from it. And Oliver, I'm curious what you think about this because, from what I'm seeing, it's not looking like a sort of console-like mainstream affordable device, is it?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. To me, this tease makes it sound like an updated ROG Ally with maybe some more device integration from the Xbox team from Windows here, because they seem to be teasing a faster device potentially than a ROG Ally. The specific tease is on the monitor the little robot is working on in this trailer. It says marathon stamina. So I think, maybe more.
We're interpreting this right now. Really? This is great.
More stamina, presumably longer battery life, right? More capacity, larger storage, right? Faster speeds, obviously a more performant processor, perhaps a Z2 processor, and fresh look, obviously a new design language. So to me, that says maybe a 1 terabyte design with an Xbox inspired design language. Again, just kind of like spitballing here. Maybe those more prominent grips we've heard, I think in a couple of pieces possibly here, which would certainly be good for ergonomics. I'd expect this to get revealed pretty soon. I'd expect maybe a release in the next 6 months or something. I'd probably expect just based off of this tease here. But yeah, I guess ultimately, like with all these Windows devices, it just comes down to what is Microsoft doing on the software side, because that's going to be a really good experience. I'm kind of skeptical, but if Microsoft can fix a lot of those issues on day one, that's good. And certainly as an alternative to like the Armoury Crate software that Asus usually ships in these devices, that could certainly be preferable. I've spent a long time fiddling with Armoury Crate in my time on Windows before I gave up on it for Bazite, of course, famously last year. And it was not always such a great experience. But I'm definitely interested in this between SteamOS, Switch 2, and Windows handhelds. Though I'm not sure which one you'd necessarily go for, because I think in the Nintendo ecosystem, Switch 2 looks really good. And then on the Steam Deck side and SteamOS side, you've got the Lenovo Legion Go S out soon, which could be quite nice. It seems quite nice to me. Obviously, you've got the classic Steam Deck and Steam Deck OLED. Those are quite nice. But I think this could be a good device if they deliver on battery life, they deliver on performance. It could be a nice high performance option. And then, of course, it's all down to Microsoft in delivering a Windows experience that actually works on a handheld, works on a controller, works on a touchscreen pretty well here. That's kind of the perennial concern, I suppose. But I trust that Asus can deliver a good handheld for sure, because they definitely have delivered good gaming handhelds in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. The Ally X, I think, was excellent. It just resolved everything that I had issues with. Well, everything, a lot of things that I had issues with the basic Ally. Stuff like I needed extra memory. You get extra memory. The battery life is awful. They got a huge battery in there.
Yeah.
So, it's not so much mitigating the problem as just like throwing a brute force solution at that particular one. So, I would expect hopefully that there would be like an evolution of the Ally X with this. I'd like to see the same amount of memory in there, but I suspect that is asking a lot. But why not? I mean, why not? And the faster speeds, you've kind of got to think it's a Z2 Extreme to do that, unless they're just going to overclock the Z1 Extreme, because there's no other options on the AMD roadmap as far as I can tell. So that should be interesting. If it's a Strix Point level device, you should get a lot of performance from that. So potentially very, very good. I'm excited. Asus know their stuff. Certainly, some of the issues that with the original Ally in terms of the thermals and whatnot were addressed with the Ally X. And then you've got the collaboration with Microsoft. I guess the question from my perspective is the extent to which Microsoft is involved in the hardware side as well as the software side. So, I mean, Microsoft really know hardware. So if it is a collaboration, not just on the shell, but on the OS, but also on the hardware, potentially very, very exciting. But even Asus on their own, they've learned a lot from the original Ally. So yes, excited. Alex, what do you think?
I mean, well, I'm really just excited from the software perspective. I don't use these handheld hard things at all, really, actually. But the from the software perspective, I'm curious to see essentially where and what areas Microsoft is going to be taking the Windows front end to work on just any sort of non-mouse device, non-keyboard device, mouse mainly. And whatever they're going to be doing there is essentially the most important thing for me. I'm also very curious to see what their equivalent of a game scope is. The game bar right now has useful stuff in it. I'm going to open it up. It's got useful stuff in it, but it also has a lot of not useful stuff in it. And it does, it also could use more. Like a lot of the stuff that GameScope does for you would be nice to see controllable from the Windows level. An actual Windows FPS cap, like they're the ones, Windows is the one fully in control of this whole presentation model. Why are we doing it through third-party programs? So it would be good to see Microsoft be pushing that angle, and then eventually see how hardware agnostic these changes to Windows are, because they'll be first tailored for this ROG Ally device. But what about other devices? What about desktop? So I want to see, this is the first step in that direction, presumably, and I just want to see exactly what stones are being laid for the road ahead.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Interesting stuff. Well, obviously, we'll be following the news on that. Microsoft did announce that they're going to be having their usual not E3 showcase in June. So I do wonder whether that's going to be the next big PR beat for it. But at the same time, putting that teaser out from Asus like a couple of weeks back does kind of suggest it might be sooner than that, but who knows at this point. Anyway, let's move on. Right, some interesting leaks this week concerning the next rollout of NVIDIA's Blackwell stack. We're going to be looking at the RTX 5060 Ti. And we've known for some time via leaks that there are going to be two models. There's going to be an 8GB model, which, let's just get this straight out of the open straight away. Don't buy it. And there's going to be the 16GB model, and which may well be worth buying. Now, the new news is that there's been a leak on pricing, seemingly from retailers or manufacturers, not sure which, but the bottom line is the prices are coming in at $379 for the 8GB model that you really shouldn't buy, and $430 for the 16GB model. Now, this is interesting because there would have been a third option here, which is to put those 3GB modules to work, and maybe produce just a unified SKU for a 12GB version at $399. You're shaking your head there, Alex.
Yeah, because it seems so obvious, right?
Right. Okay. I thought you were disagreeing with my
No, I'm in love with
there.
the idea. It just seems like, once again, for some reason, NVIDIA is putting more VRAM on a lower end card than on the higher end card, and everyone's question marking this, like, what's going on?
there is consumer confusion for sure there, because if you did have that notional 399 12 gigabyte model, then the consumer confusion goes away. It has the same amount of memory as the 5070, not more. But that's apparently what we're getting: 379, 429. 16 gigabytes, 429, obviously the one to buy. The question is whether the value is there at that point. Alex, this is a bit of a mess, really, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, at least the 8 gigabytes of extra memory isn't a $100 price premium the way it was for the 4060 Ti.
No.
Which was basically an upsell to get a 4070 at that point. $100 more for a lot more performance. So it does seem as though Nvidia has listened to a certain extent, but I can only imagine that they sold so many 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte models that they've just decided to do another one. But it's not ideal, is it?
No, I would love to see the industry get past for baseline cards the 8 gigabyte, because that means people roll over their GPU, as in they buy a new one, every 5 years, probably 5 years, I would say, for someone who's getting like 4060-ish level of GPU. They're not as connected into the whole, they're already budget minded anyways, and then they're not as connected into the whole, I need to buy a new thing every year kind of mentality that we see in the enthusiast press, right? But as a result of that, we're going to have baseline SKUs of the presumably 5060 and 5060 Ti selling with 8 gigabytes for the next 2 years until the next generation launches, 2.5 years maybe.
Yeah.
And that means that's a whole nother group of 8 gigabyte GPUs that are going to have to be considered in minimum specs for the next 6 to 8 years or something like that, just with the way people are upgrading. And I would prefer very much so if in like 5 years, developers didn't even have to think about an 8 gigabyte GPU anymore for their development of their games. I'm not saying it's holding back stuff like a Series S is, but it's definitely making developers spend more time than they possibly could want to by that point. Right now, I think it's very reasonable if a developer spends time on 8 gigabyte GPUs as part of their development, making that experience good. But in 5 years, I'd say it's silly. And I think this is just prolonging that time period, that switchover, when for a slightly higher price in between the $50 markup here, they could have had a 12 gigabyte GPU as the base, and they could have done that as well for the 5060, whatever that's going to look like. And I think it would have just had like the way people would respond to the GPU is much different. And I think NVIDIA is going to see that whenever they sample these GPUs to reviewers, they're going to see an extremely negative reaction to the 8 gigabytes, I'm pretty sure, everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what can we say? I mean, 8 gigabytes, we're going all the way back to like the RX 580. Which, that was like I don't know, that was like 2015, 2016, something along those lines.
Yeah, it's long ago.
And, come on now. We've got to move on from that. And, I'm really interested to seeing what the official benchmarks are going to look like and whether Indiana Jones is on it or not.
Yeah.
Right. Otherwise,
because, I mean, this is kind of like the situation we're in. The only reason I can think that they didn't go for 399 12 gig is availability of those 3 gigabyte modules. You can get them on the 5090 laptops, right? Which is going to be a pretty niche product. You're talking about a laptop that's thousands of dollars. So I could only assume that maybe these modules are in short supply at the moment, because it doesn't really make sense to me to have 2 SKUs. It just introduces consumer confusion, particularly when one could, in theory, review quite well. And the other one is just going to have like comedy thumbnails and, comedy thumbnails saying it's a disaster, waste of silicon, etc., etc. So yes, that is sort of baffling to me. But I've said it once and I'll say it again. I think of the entire 40 series lineup, the most the worst offering of the bunch was probably the 4060 Ti 8 gig. And at the same time, you look at the Steam hardware survey and it's right up there. So, obviously a lot of people probably towards the more budget end of the market probably aren't really watching reviews or anything like that. But at the same time, if you're spending like $400 or even $380, assuming this rumor pans out, on a new GPU, you should be able to be playing Indiana Jones on it with no issues whatsoever, or even The Last of Us.
Yeah, like
or any of the other games where we've run it, Monster Hunter World, all of those other games where there have been issues with 8 gigabytes, it's kind of got to come to an end now. And I think the other thing which is slightly concerning is that, while we're in rumor land, is the fact that it seems like AMD is going to be following suit with the 9060 in terms of offering 8 and 16 gigabyte variants. And, that just doesn't make sense, particularly with AMD, where they've done so much right with this generation. They've really made an impact with RDNA 4. Don't ruin it with with relatively expensive 8 gigabyte cards.
Yeah.
Oliver, curious what you make about all of this. Obviously, it's unconfirmed at the moment, but it kind of has the ring of truth about it.
I mean, the sticker pricing to me is not that offensive to me. Just the existence of that 8 gigabyte card is offensive to me, especially at this bracket, which is like not a premium bracket, but like it is a pretty decent little gaming card, presumably, if it's like a last generation predecessor. It's not too slow for current gen titles by any means. It's going to give you probably good experience, except for that 8 gigabyte frame buffer, which is obviously a problem. But yeah, I think this is probably going to end up going up against a lot of like used 40 series cards, used 30 series cards. That's what I would expect this to mostly come up against. And the 9060 and 9060 XT, I think relative to those used cards, this generation, I think the general thinking is that if you can get a similar nominal tier of card of the last generation product, unless you're really into MFG, that's probably the best, better buy if it's coming in at a significantly lower price there.
I'm really looking forward to seeing it because basically, well, from my perspective as a GPU reviewer, the lower down the stack you get, I actually think the products kind of get a lot more interesting because, ultimately, when you're sort of dealing with like a 5080 or a 5090, the natural behavior is to just whack everything at ultra and leave it at that. And most of the time you're fine, right? But as you go down the stack and you start looking at, 60 class products, that's when optimized settings comes into play and becomes a lot more impactful. And, and you are dealing with a level of horsepower here. In theory, well, the 4060 Ti, not tested it, but I reckon it's probably going to be very competitive with a PS5 Pro. And so the 5060 Ti, in theory, certainly the 16 gigabyte model should be, an iterative step beyond that. Plus you have MFG and whatnot. And in terms of how we're going to review the 5060 Ti, I honestly think, well, it's going to be people that probably got a 3060 Ti back in the day. I think that's probably the natural progression point from it. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I'm also what can I say? I was going to say I'm looking forward to the 5060, but all the signs are indicating it's an 8 gigabyte card. I could only assume that those 3 gigabyte modules are in short supply, and that's the reason they can't put out a 12 gigabyte version. Or they looked at the rampant success of the 4060 and decided it's a problem for another day, but that's really not the attitude to have at this point. Because you're quite right, Alex, these cards stick around, particularly at the lower end of the stack. They stick around for, I think you're right, probably about 5 years. I think there's probably going to be a lot of 3060 owners potentially looking at the 5060. And, well, in games where there's VRAM problems, that's going to be an interesting head-to-head. And that's a shame because the 3060, I kind of like it, but only because it's got 12 gigabytes of RAM. The actual performance of it isn't that great. It's a good chunk slower than a PS5, for example. But yeah, I mean, I'm just sad that we're being put in this position, really, because in a world where the Switch 2 is apparently shipping with 12 gigs of memory. Come on. That's
Yeah.
a bit sad, isn't it?
I'd hope that in maybe 12 months, 8 months or something, we could have a super refresh line, and that could
Yeah.
use these 3 GB modules. I'd hope for that, and that could become the new baseline. Like the 5060 Super could be a 12 GB card, then we could be done with this 8 GB nonsense, at least, for a while. Hopefully for most market segments, we could bring them up to 12 GB, which is kind of like the I think the minimum you really want to be at, especially for a card you're going to have for a few years.
I'm also looking at these cards right now at the specs here, and it's nice to see us being back to 448 gigabytes per second of bandwidth after having left it in the 4000 series generation. I feel like that generation really, they were super cost cutting on so many things. The half PCIe lanes, the reduced bus, even from the 3060. Like that, I think that was like 192-bit bus.
It was, yeah.
128. Yeah. So it's like they just reduced everything, and then the shading performance was the thing that was bringing everything up. Now, thanks to higher, better memory chips, we're getting the total bandwidth up higher. And I think as a result, like you're saying, Rich, we'll see a GPU that will compare, at least with the 5060 Ti 16 GB version, will compare very nicely with something like a PlayStation 5 Pro. But at the same time, like we could have been there last gen at the same time with just very different specs launching. Like I felt like those cards, I don't like the 4060. I actually don't like it at all. I think I've said this quite often on the stream, but every single time I use it, I'm like, I have to do so much more testing with the 4060 to see what the cause of an issue is, because there are so many weak points in the GPU. Whereas with other ones, I already know. Like with the 2070 Super, I know it's going to be VRAM, but I don't think it'll be PCIe lanes, right? Or I don't think it'll be some other aspect of the GPU. But I'm always doubtful, and I have to do more work due to the RTX 4060's existence.
Yeah, but it's been hugely successful. And not just in the desktop form, in the laptop form. I think it's quite interesting now that you get delineation on the Steam hardware survey between a 4060 desktop and a 4060 laptop, and they're both up there. They're both up there in the top 10. It's quite remarkable, really.
No clue.
Anyway, with that, let's move on. Okay, so there's been a lot of controversy this week with Microsoft releasing an AI version, a full AI-generated version of Quake 2. And you can actually demo it. It's quite interesting to fire it up in your browser and get this extremely low frame rate version of Quake 2, but it is entirely AI driven. There isn't a game engine there as such, as far as I'm aware. And I guess it works. There's been a lot of pushback to it, and some of the pushback I noticed on Twitter was actually there was pushback to the pushback from none other than John Carmack himself, saying, whoa, hold on a minute, I actually think this is pretty cool for what it is. But Alex, have you given it a go? Because I have, and it just didn't work after after like less than 20 seconds. It just started producing very weird stuff.
I've tried it out, and I mean, I find it interesting that it can learn the generic structure of the beginning of Quake 2's level, and it doesn't start at the beginning of Quake 2's first level, which is more geometrically complex than the latter half of the level, because you have to go down multiple sets of stairs with obscuring geometry in the way. That's very important. I wonder if that's purposeful. But I think the core issue here for me is implying that it is Quake 2. I mean, it is using Quake 2's art as the basis for this, and it's trained on videos of Quake 2 being played. So it isn't like hooking up to the raw game data here. So it's interesting that it can get like 3D facsimiles of aspects of Quake 2 there. But it isn't Quake 2. Like Quake 2 has a very set, defined amount of like health, ammo, and a level, enemy placement. All these things are very well and very purposefully made. And since this isn't recreating that aspect of it, in fact, it's constantly forgetting those aspects of it, I wouldn't even call this Quake 2. I would call this a Quake 2 visual demo, but not Quake 2. And I find that just I do find it a little bit insulting, because it's like saying video games are just like the visual aspect and not like the gameplay aspect. And that is not at all what I think about video games. So, other than that, I think it's just technically interesting that this exists, but the limitations are so extreme. Like the lack of object permanence is incredible. The lack of interactivity with enemies makes it not Quake 2, like I described earlier. You really shouldn't be like looking up and down and not seeing the world again. And I think the fact that they put out a demo that has that issue in it is strange. I thought they would maybe want to work that issue out first in the model, because right now it's kind of seeming like the one thing I've seen with these AI models is the lack of object permanence over time is like the biggest hindrance of it like being consistent over time.
Yeah.
And they just put out a demo that shows it off extremely. So I don't know if it's like a pure limitation that we should expect for years to come or what. But I guess it's kind of interesting, but I really wish they phrased this completely differently.
Right. Okay. It is like a sort of, well, it's an interactive experience based on Quake 2.
Sure.
But not Quake 2. Oliver.
Yeah, I have a bit of a more positive view. Perhaps that's not a big surprise to people, but I think about it a little more positively. First of all, I think they are training it on Quake 2 video footage, but I think it's paired with inputs critically, right? So they can mimic that. So it's trained on the inputs and the game visual data and audio data perhaps as well. But I thought this was a pretty cool demo just because of, again, I guess it depends on your point of reference, because to me, this actually seems super stable and reliable. But obviously it isn't super stable and reliable. It's horrible in a lot of respects, but relative to earlier demos that have been shown off, it's actually doing some pretty impressive stuff, I think, because it looks very much like Quake 2. You can walk around, and especially if you're like moving forward through the level and not really looking around too much, that's when you start to get tripped up. But if you're looking forward and you walk through the level, it's like, yeah, this is Quake 2, there's enemies there. This is going on. I can collide with walls and there's collision. And so I'm getting that visual feedback and it's looking kind of like roughly in line. Now, granted, I'm not as familiar with Quake 2. I've not played as many hours of it probably as Alex has, but there's, some indication here that this is actually a real Quake 2 world. Now, the problems, I found problems pretty easily just with things I knew what to do. Like if you're spinning in place, it doesn't have a good sense of object permanence, right? Like a toddler almost. So if you spin the camera, you can respawn barrels, like break a barrel, spin the camera, barrel's back there, right? That kind of issue. It can struggle with collision somewhat. Sometimes you can kind of walk through walls. Sometimes you can teleport places. Just spin the camera for like 5 seconds and you'll be somewhere totally different, or the world will have shifted around you, or the hallways, corridors, whatever, enemies that'll be totally different. So obviously that's not good. And obviously the visual quality of the demo is very low. I think it's running at 360p technically, and the frame rate is very low. It might be, I don't know, I'd be surprised if it's much above 10 frames per second. It's quite a low frame rate experience there. But I think critically, it's not really a game. Like this is not really a game to me. And I think that this is a really cool system potentially for prototyping new game ideas. There was the Google Genie AI that was demoed a few months ago that was able to create a new playable interactive experience, a very simple one, from a prompt, right? It was able to create something that is actually playable. You could explore for a minute before it lost coherency completely. And that was kind of cool. And Microsoft's use case with this is like maybe you could bring a game into this and prompt it with new weapons or ideas or systems or whatever and get some kind of loosely playable result. Now, of course, this is a very low fidelity iteration of that. I don't expect this to be that product necessarily, but in the future, that could certainly be an interesting route for game developers to go down, possibly by implementing these things within kind of like this hallucinated world and then possibly bringing that into their games. I think that's kind of an interesting angle on it. But I think the way that Microsoft is pitching it now to me is totally bizarre. Like Phil Spencer was mentioning, it is a tool for preservation. I can't see that at the moment. I kind of almost disagree with it conceptually, but especially when you have emulators flying around and source ports and things like this, like you could almost say, okay, well, what if those facilities aren't available, and maybe this technology develops into something really high fidelity, but in that kind of AI inflected world where that all is happening, you'd presume that the capability to develop a good emulator or a good source port would also be increased. So I don't really understand that part of it either. I also kind of have a hard time, like just the term game preservation, I don't think applies to this whole effort where there's no logic here. It's just a hallucination of the general characteristics of a game. And so to me, that does not really double up for what the real thing is. And it can't really be, it can be game preservation in kind of a loose sense, but I don't really think it can be true game preservation. So I do think these have a role potentially in the future. I mean, I think the underlying technology is interesting. I think what they're doing with it is interesting. But in terms of this actually being like a way that you would play a version of Quake 2 preferentially over other ways to play Quake 2 and as a kind of means to preserve this game for all time, I really think that the technology is probably inappropriate for that purpose, even if it improves like a lot.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, the whole game preservation thing I just find utterly bizarre because, I mean, let's say for what are you preserving here? Presumably, you're preserving something that you'd need to train from. And if you can train from it, then why don't you just distribute whatever it is you're training from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it would likely be based on PC, right? Or or a console version or whatever. But you've got to train it from something. You can't go to an AI. Hey, do you remember playing this game back in 1990? We can't play it now. Can you magic up a new version? That's not going to work. Maybe I'm missing something there. But the other thing, of course, is that if you do have that original source, it's a similar level of inefficiency to like the Antstream retro game streamer, where they've developed this gigantic retro streaming system and a streaming video when the actual original games are very, very small in size with a very light CPU or potentially GPU footprint. And, you might as well just distribute the original code. And, obviously the computational cost of AI at the moment is super, super large by comparison. So, yeah, that's interesting. It kind of strikes at the heart of viability there in terms of whatever game preservation stuff they're talking about. I'd love to get a proper idea of what's being said by that, because smart people are saying it and I don't understand why they're saying it.
Mhm.
In terms of the other stuff, I mean, yes, I mean, well, I played it for like a few seconds because it just stopped working and I tried to reconnect and it didn't. So that was problematic. In terms of the stuff you're talking about, Alex, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, AI is exponentially increasing in performance. So, stuff that's a problem now may not be a problem like 2 years, a year even from now. The amount of, huge leaps we've seen from AI in recent times has been quite remarkable. And I don't think that sort of curve is going to be changing anytime soon based on the gold rush that's out there.
Right.
But at the same time, the thing about AI is that it's never a perfect solution, right? There's always going to be some problem with it. And the whole point of game systems is that you kind of have to rely on them. The amount of times that we, that games that launch with bugs get mocked, for the various outlandish things that occur. I mean, who knows what's going to happen if you have an AI game, hallucinating some weird stuff going on. Who knows what horrors await us?
Yay.
Yeah. I also just think this is sidestepping a number of important questions about game preservation, because ultimately, like, when you look at a studio like Night Dive, when they're going back to talk to rights holders about their games, they're often not talking about how difficult will this be to get running under the Kex engine. They're saying, how difficult is it going to be to reconcile all these rights holders to get us this game, right? It's a legal issue. In some cases, it's a platform issue. In some cases, maybe you need to secure some kind of deal with a platform holder. You need to secure some deal with the rights holders to get this game in your system. None of those issues go away, I don't think, if you're hallucinating this game. If you're clearly hallucinating a copyrighted work on which you've trained, I don't think those issues go away. They don't go away if you want to emulate the game, obviously, but you need to sidestep those issues. You need to find a way around those legal issues, potentially, for many of these games in order to sell them. Sometimes that means working with many different publishers, many different studios. Sometimes it means working with a mega corporation that isn't too eager to let you distribute a game that they released maybe 15 years ago. So those are other issues that just have to ultimately deal with, like, why preserving games is so difficult, right? That need to be addressed.
But Oliver, I think you've forgotten that basically AI is running roughshod over the concept of copyright. It doesn't care. It shall consume all of these works with no remorse and no legal recourse.
I think when it comes to literally replicating, like, image for image a copyrighted work with the intent of displacing the market for that copyrighted work from the original rights holder. I
That might be
suspect
problematic.
that's
Yeah.
now obviously there's like this abstract notion of, well, you trained this LLM on all human knowledge and now it can kind of replicate my writing style or something. That's a different conversation than we fed it Quake 2 game data and now we're distributing Quake 2, but technically it's not running Quake 2. I don't think that flies. I don't think the US Copyright Office is going to accept that argument.
Okay, fair enough. Well, obviously things are going to be moving at a quick pace here. Interested to see what happens next. Also kind of worried, but I get the idea of what you're saying about, potentially using it for prototyping. That could make sense. Anyway, let's move on. Final news story of the week. Not so much a news story, just some mucking about I've been doing. Obviously, Switch 2, we know a fair bit now about its capabilities based on the footage that we've seen so far. And, we've kind of got a handle now on what it can do. But what we haven't really got a handle, and certainly at the time of recording this, I've not even gone hands-on with Switch 2. We don't really know what can happen with the portable side of things. So back in the day, I used an Nvidia RTX 2050, massively downclocked, to simulate what a Switch 2 could do from a desktop perspective, how DLSS works. You can see that video, just search for T239. And, the conclusion was, it was like, hey, this is like essentially PS4 level performance overall, but you can use stuff like DLSS, potentially even ray tracing. Now, that was with the docked situation, right? Where we were kind of simulating a 1 gigahertz GPU by using a bigger GPU, but downclocking it to like 750. What if we did the same thing for mobile based on the leaked specifications? So the same GPU, but that GPU apparently runs, I think it's 561 megahertz,
That's
but
correct,
with our bigger GPU, I've taken it down to 420 megahertz.
My goodness.
And I'll tell you what, I mean, I was quite surprised. It was quite reasonable, certainly potential here. I mean, let's begin with kind of like a standard game that we use for mobile testing control. This is actually the game outputting at 1080p, but it's using the internal scaler. It's going up from 720p. And this is using console equivalent settings, which is essentially a mixture of low and medium. Low for basically everything, medium textures, medium reflections, global reflections. I think that pretty much sums it up. And it's not bad. It's not as fast as Steam Deck, though, curiously, which kind of chimes in with some of the stuff we were talking about in the direct that we did previously about Switch 2. But, it runs all right. It's, it's above 30 frames per second. I think you'd have a perfectly playable experience on that, and that's fine, But that is a game that does run pretty well on mobile hardware. It runs great on Steam Deck, where you can pretty much lock it to 40 frames per second at 720p, and it's a really great experience. So let's go all out. Let's look at Cyberpunk 2077. And I'm not sparing the horses here, because the settings here are basically equivalent to the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X performance mode, right? That's the core settings that we've used there. And 720p output. I mean, the docked experience seems to be a 1080p max output. Dynamic resolution, now you can use DLSS with DRS on Cyberpunk. And this is actually the transformer model of DLSS. So internally here, we're going to be moving from 360p all the way up to 720p, I dare say, depending on content. And I've used Special K here to lock to 30 frames per second, because for some reason the in-game 30 FPS limiter just wasn't present for some reason. It's kind of all right. I mean, I think it looks fairly good, bearing in mind we've got a 420 megahertz GPU here from a 2020 generation architecture. So I'm kind of thinking there's potential here. I mean, I don't think they would be using PS5 performance mode settings in the mobile version of Cyberpunk. It kind of works for me, I think, overall. It's certainly playable. There are some issues with some of the content, specifically the stuff when you're in the the Phantom Liberty area, that black marketplace.
Yeah.
And you'll notice if you go back to our frame rate analysis of the actual Switch 2 version, which we think is the docked mode here, that too is dropping to like a minimum of 23 frames per second. So there is, that's a particularly heavy area. But other stuff is working out all right. And this is using the DLSS transformer model. However, I think it's fair to say, Alex, that, image quality isn't exactly great.
It's okay for what it is. I mean, it isn't good at all, but it also is, based upon the GPU you're throwing this at this and the cost of that transformer model, you could probably be getting higher resolution internal res by just using like a simple TAA. And maybe technically it could also be comparable image quality, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there for not using DLSS, and we'll talk about why in a minute. I also tried the CNN version of DLSS, which is considerably more performant on this hardware, as you would imagine, bearing in mind we've got an already weak, this is one of the weakest Ampere GPUs available, and we've massively downclocked it. DLSS in CNN mode is basically running a fair bit faster. I think it's 10% faster. But, image quality still isn't great. And I actually think the cost of DLSS is such that probably a TAA upscale with a better internal resolution would probably be the way forward there. This is just basically a bit of fun, really. We're really pushing things here because I don't think that the console's performance mode setting selection is probably a good fit for mobile hardware. There's probably better optimizations to be made for that level of hardware. I did run native 720p as well in that black market area from Phantom Liberty, and it's still, you've got to go lower than 720p at these settings to get a locked 30. But let's talk about DLSS. This is all incredibly hypothetical because, ultimately all we can really do here is come up with a very low performance Ampere GPU that's kind of in the vaguest of ballparks using probably inappropriate settings. But we can sort of measure the cost of DLSS on such a relatively slow GPU. And I shared the figures with you. And Alex, there's not really any surprises here. What I did was, first of all, to benchmark the game at 720p native and then basically add DLAA, which is basically adding the DLSS pass on top of that. And basically, the DLSS pass for the transformer model is 9.23 milliseconds, which I don't think any developer in their right mind would be using that when you've got a 33 millisecond frame time. And the CNN model was 5.56 milliseconds, which is still a substantial chunk. I think there's much easier ways. Using the GPU for increased resolution and doing a simple TAA pass probably makes a lot more sense. But I also used FSR3 in native AA mode, 7.72 milliseconds. That's off the table as well, I think, for a GPU like this. Curious stuff. I'm curious about your thoughts about this.
Yeah, well, I would say this is the dilemma of when and when not to use DLSS. As soon as it becomes such a large part of your frame time budget, like we see with an additional 9.2 milliseconds there by using the transformer model, that's really expensive. And that's, it's about a little less than 1/3 of your frame time dedicated to just anti-aliasing and upscaling.
Yeah.
And the whole idea is with at least the CNN model with its 5.5 milliseconds there, what you could argue is that, okay, well, if I drop res enough, I'm making up for that time and maybe getting extra. And that's arguably what could be happening if they were to use it. But then you'd have to look at the image quality gains and see if that is worth it or whether you push for a higher internal res. At the end of the day, you're going to be looking at this not like we are by doing back and forth, I would say, with a timeline of how much milliseconds. Rather, you'd have like the full timeline chart of the GPU, and you'd be looking at like each discrete step and seeing like how many milliseconds you're getting here or there at the end, because that's how you're going to plug and pull settings as well too. So I think a developer, when they're making this decision, I would be really, what is the phrase, flummoxed? I don't know. I would be very surprised if they were making the decision to do like 720p DLSS at all, ever. Because on that little screen, will you be getting the benefits of DLSS as much as you would be getting it in the big, the living room experience? Maybe not. Maybe there's better ways to spend that power.
Yeah. Oliver, what do you think about all of this? I mean, I'd say it's kind of miraculous that it runs at all at such a very, very, very low GPU clock.
Yeah. I mean, the image quality is not very good here. Sometimes on foot, it's all right, I would say. But in the car, when you're moving fast, getting all that disoccluded detail, it's really kind of ugly there. I think the internal resolution with DLSS, either in CNN or transformer mode, would probably be very, very low there. And obviously here you're scaling from 720p no matter what you do. Like, we're not even attempting 1080p, which is obviously the native resolution of the panel. I think that, that's off the table in any circumstance. But based on our initial look at the game, I think it's probably using TAA, their TAA there, possibly, just because of the fact that the resolutions are like in the 720p range for docked play, presumably. And there's one shot we think might come from handheld where it's like 540p-ish. So that kind of seems like it would align with where you'd expect it to be without an expensive upscaling process. To me, that seems like a plausible number there. So perhaps that's what they're doing. But in general, I think this is a really helpful reality check, because I've seen a lot of discussion online, a lot of people debating this, especially after we published last week's DF Direct, which was about this topic to some substantial degree. And, the evidence that we have that's high quality evidence, like our direct comparisons, our pixel counts, it's not going to be this mega powerful thing, especially out of the gate. It's not going to be, even a portable PS4 in handheld form necessarily. It's something that's probably going to fall short of some expectations, I think, here. If you have kind of an unreasonable view of how well, an 8 nanometer Ampere chip can operate within a 10 watt power budget, or even a 30 watt power budget in docked play, it's still a substantially power limited device there. But that's not a reason to be pessimistic. Like, I think that'll probably produce a fine enough version of Cyberpunk, I imagine. Like, a lot of PS4 games can still look pretty good here, and a lot of PS4 games do still look really good. And I don't think we need to be reaching for the stars in this one and putting all our faith in DLSS and putting all of our faith in various advanced GPU features here to necessarily have a good experience. So I just want to offer that little bit of cold water on this, possibly, because I think we do see from our various bits of testing here, and indeed Rich's testing with this very, very low power Nvidia Ampere GPU, that, the Switch 2 is, it's a powerful machine. It's certainly a very powerful machine relative to the Switch 1, but you shouldn't expect miracles out of it if you're used to like good experiences on current generation quality hardware.
Yeah, I think, everything I've seen on Switch 2 so far, and bearing in mind that by the time if this goes out, I would have actually been hands-on with it, but not at this point in the timeline. Everything I've seen, I'm actually quite impressed with it, right? It was interesting to note that the running the RTX 2050 at 750 megahertz, the power consumption was like 16 watts. So that's kind of what I would expect, ballpark, from what the GPU would be doing in the actual unit, based on what I saw. That's super, super efficient stuff. And it's producing results that are like PS4 level. Which I think is pretty phenomenal, to be honest, bearing in mind that the PS4 Slim was like drawing 80 watts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's remarkable in terms of efficiency. And, handheld stuff. I mean, again, it is just a bit of fun. I just wanted to see what would happen if we downclocked an Ampere GPU and try to run Cyberpunk on it effectively. But, the actual Cyberpunk will be tailored to the device. It will be using the dedicated APIs that NVIDIA has developed. They will be altering content to be more optimal for the device. But even so, I got it running on a GPU that's incredibly constrained in terms of performance. So, everything's looking pretty good. I just really am looking forward to seeing the handheld experience. And the other thing, of course, is that a lot of games aren't going to be third-party ports, and the Nintendo stuff's looking great. Bear in mind the what the device is, and I'm quite impressed by it. So looking forward to seeing more.
Yeah, Nintendo in particular seems to be pulling off the high resolutions and high frame rates that people are looking for out of
which makes
current
sense,
generation
right?
hardware. Yeah, it makes sense, and it makes sense especially considering maybe their approach to development is a little bit different. But ultimately, I think you're going to get good results out of the system, especially if you're looking at those titles like Mario Kart, high resolution, high frame rate, really exciting stuff there.
Yeah, there is also still the concept of the light DLSS, which there's been talked about in the Nintendo patents, which, I guess we just have to wait and see it, right? I mean, I think the fact that it was actually quite hard to tell DLSS being an effect in any of the stuff we've seen so far is telling, and it does kind of tie into the computational cost of it, which is still quite significant. But I don't know, the thing about the Switch is that the original one defied expectations, as I said last week. I mean, it produced some really fantastic stuff across its lifespan, stuff that we just didn't think was possible. And, the same guys who did all of that stuff for the original Switch are likely to be moving on to Switch 2, and I can't wait to see what they come up with. But with that, let's move on. Okay, let's move on to supporter Q&A. That's the part of the show where every week I ask our supporters on Patreon to come up with a range of questions to test the team. And I choose the best, or rather the ones we're best equipped to answer. And let's just crack on. This one comes from Cameron. Hey all, long-time YouTube lurker, new Patreon subscriber. Hope to get your thoughts on how Nintendo's implementation of the DLSS tensor and ray tracing hardware may factor into future handhelds like Steam Deck 2. AMD seems to be taking their own approach to Nvidia's tech with RDNA 4. And while their upcoming APUs seem to be holding at RDNA 3.5, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on if this could be the jump in performance Valve is waiting for, and if we may see this implemented in mobile SoCs in the future. As a follow-on question, is this something that would bring benefits to handheld PCs where games aren't made for a single piece of target hardware? Oliver?
I think with the NVIDIA side of things, it's a little bit tricky because of the ARM issues that would presumably be at play here. I do think that they'll be launching a product in this segment. Apparently they are launching a product in this segment at some point over the next 6 months or 12 months, but I'd have some concerns there possibly, but I think it could possibly be there could be a possibility for a product like that to make inroads here. On the AMD side, like this person says, it does seem like RDNA 4 is not coming to handhelds. I certainly think that could be very beneficial. But just as a general matter, like with these handhelds, they're constrained along a number of different axes. Like it's not just like consoles where we look at console hardware and we're like, this would be really good if they had a really good machine learning based upscaler, right? On like say a PlayStation 5 or Series X. Here with the handhelds, we're really talking about like the number of CPU cores is an issue sometimes, the CPU architecture, CPU clock speed, GPU size, memory bandwidth, like they're constrained along all axes. Like when I look at a Steam Deck in a demanding current generation title like Dragon's Dogma 2, it's really like not fast enough, but in every single direction. And the upscaler is almost a secondary concern where it's like, well, even if I push the upscaler as hard as I possibly can and get a horrible visual result, I can't get good enough performance. So it's like, I just feel like it's a lot of that more boring stuff that is kind of lacking across this sector of handhelds. And I'd hope that maybe, an NVIDIA handheld, if one was to exist, an NVIDIA PC handheld, if they could really leverage hopefully some advanced manufacturing processes and just bring big improvements everywhere. That's what I'd hope for. Not just on the side of things where NVIDIA is like really sexy right now. It's like the whole thing has to improve a lot, I feel like.
I tend to agree. Alex?
Yeah, just to put it in perspective in terms of like a GPU timeline. And we saw this back when Claybook launched for Nintendo Switch, where Seb Altonen made mention of the fact that they used dynamic resolution scaling, which, combined with TAAU at that time to get good performance on all of the platforms they use, except on Switch, where it didn't bring them much of anything. They could drop that res ridiculously low on Switch, But it didn't really matter because the thing that was taking up so much dedicated time on the GPU was just the raw compute of doing the game's basic functions. And in this game's case, it was like particle simulations. And for other games, this could be like the generation of cube maps. It could be the amount of raw geometry on screen. It could, in a game that does use extensively compute shaders, a variety of different things that where dropping the res or introducing an upscaler doesn't really have much of any positive effect, even in just a purely GPU limited scenario. So you have to think about, like, as much as we do that on PC quite often, Oliver said, that is a much larger surface for things to like spread across. And in the case of Switch 2 and handheld PCs, they are so much more constrained on every angle. And you have to start thinking about completely, just like there's just stuff that just didn't scale at some point anymore. So you can't really do much about it. That's why I think Oliver's too big for Steam Deck videos are actually really good, even though they've gotten some strange controversy about them. How dare you, Oliver, point out that the Steam Deck cannot play these games, maybe. But I think they're very important to give us like a real sense of like how games scale and what if someone's buying a device they want to know. So I'm very curious to see what these predecessors to these devices, how they attack this problem.
You mean the successors to the device?
Yeah, the successors. Did I say that? Yeah. I said that wrong.
Yeah, I mean, Oliver, too big for Steam Deck works fine on my Steam Deck.
That's always the refrain.
That magic Steam Deck.
Works fine. Yeah. Going back to Cameron's question here. I agree with you, Oliver. I think maybe the CPU situation has been kind of resolved in that all of the non-Steam Deck handhelds out there have 8 cores rather than 4. And you were seeing some in your last Too Big for Steam Deck video. There were some dramatic differences between Deck and certain other handhelds on certain games. I think AMD are fully cognizant that they need some sort of decent upscaler for their APUs that are going into handhelds. And in actual fact, the first we heard of FSR4 was like, hey, we've got to make our handheld performance better, and this is the way we're going to do it. But that's not what FSR4 came out as, which is quite interesting, which maybe there is some sort of offshoot for RDNA 3.5. I don't know. Who knows? Yes, and then you've basically got the GPU in Steam Deck isn't really performant enough, and it kind of is in other handhelds with bigger chips, but those chips require like 30 watts being put through them, which is not ideal really for a handheld. And yeah, the Asus ROG Ally, I mean, I love it, but it's got an 80 watt hour battery in it. It's like 4 times as large as Switch 2. It's kind of nuts, really, isn't it? And even then, you're getting like 2 hours battery life. There's a lot going on with handhelds, and I think what's going to happen is that the AMD APUs, which are kind of designed primarily for laptops, they're going to continue to be used in handhelds. And that's where we're going to see the most performance. But I think it's going to be something quite different that we'll see with Steam Deck 2 in the end, and we may have to wait a considerable time for it. Just the direction of travel is more towards efficiency as opposed to like throwing lots of power and horsepower at the problem. That's what I got to say about that, really. Let's move on. A question here from Dudley the Gentleman. Hi, DF Gentleman. What are your thoughts on NVIDIA open sourcing their PhysX and Flow GPU source code? There'll likely be a ton of work to repair the compatibility issues on 5000 series cards. Is there potential for PhysX effects to actually become more performant on GPUs due to potential optimization and better GPU utilization? Second, do you think we'll see PhysX and Flow effects being implemented in games or mods that didn't already support these features now? A question that's right up your alley, I guess, Alex.
Yeah. So there's 2 parts of this. What are my thoughts on NVIDIA open sourcing their PhysX and Flow GPU source code? That's what I said they should do a couple weeks back. Whenever we originally reported on that. I said the only really good way to make do with what they've done is to open source it so that it can be handled by other people potentially. And the amount of work that will be required is probably going to be pretty high because something like Flow, as far as I understand it, doesn't run on CUDA actually, and that can be easily cross compatible with other devices. But PhysX 32-bit support, you have to deal with the fact that, well, even if they were to open source it, it's not like you could just all of a sudden retrofit that into like a 64-bit wrapper or something like that. That just doesn't work. You'd also have to deal with the fact that 5000 series GPUs lack the hardware to do this. I think that's the whole thing. They cut off the hardware, and so that there was no point in supporting it on the software side anymore, which is why the deprecation occurred. So there would have to be something completely differently done, I think, in that aspect. And I actually think that is a translation or a rewrite of CUDA 32-bit to some other thing, like, I don't know, OpenCL, direct compute, etc. Now, I don't think that would lead to better optimization in GPU utilization, because CUDA is presumably much closer to aligned to NVIDIA's hardware than the generic cross-platform solutions. And also the fact that a lot of the games that use PhysX are DirectX 9 class games, where there wasn't really a sense of compute anyway in that API. And there wasn't a sense of like, well, a lot of things were just done differently. Like there wasn't compute at all. And then there was no idea of like overlapping work generally. So I think the way you would get better compute in those environments under some scheme that would, be converting these calls would be to have it actually be a game that's already being translated with like DXVK to Vulkan. And then you could actually have a lot more interoperability and better performance than potentially you would have originally had under the DX9 version of the game. A lot of people have tried to run or do run games that are, DX9 with PhysX on series GPUs that are not RTX 5000, like RTX 4000, 3000. And they notice sometimes that the performance isn't as good as they potentially would have thought. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there wasn't any like concurrency in DX9. So there would be like a context switch as soon as PhysX stuff would occur and the game halts rendering. And that really slows down performance a lot more than it would in a more modern API. And these are a lot of things that just happen. So that is a very complex way to answer the question. But to just be very precise about one thing, there is something out there called Zluda, I believe it is called Zluda. It is an effort to bring CUDA to other platforms, the things that were done in 32-bit CUDA and elsewhere to other platforms. And the developer of that, a gentleman whose name I've forgotten at the moment,
as usual.
But they have said that they have 32-bit PhysX support in their sites now, ever since it has been released. So the guy's name is Andrei Yannick, I believe, who makes Zluda. So
interesting.
Do it, Andrei. I'm very excited.
Okay, next question. This one comes from Circe. Nintendo seemed to begin to embrace a lot of industry standards like HDR, high refresh rate gaming, 4K and more, but still seem to cap the console at 4K 60. Is the new dock still not HDMI 2.1 compliant, or is it just Nintendo not wanting to give us false hope, like that 8K badge on the PS5? So yeah, Oliver, this was an interesting wrinkle to the Switch 2's specifications, which is to say that it seems to have HDMI 2.1 features, such as VRR and I believe even ALLM. However, it doesn't support 4K 120. It does support 4K 60 and 1440p 120. So has there been any sort of clarification on what's going on here?
The small amount of clarification I can offer is it seems to come from the converter that converts the DisplayPort 1.4 in the Switch to HDMI 2.1. So the converter they're using in the dock is apparently a Realtek RTD2175NCG. It's probably only good for up to 4K 60 regularly, because there's a predecessor model that's the exact same, but instead of 2175, it's 2173. And that model only goes up to 4K 60 or 1440p 120. It can do 4K 120 and 8K 60, but with DSC, right? Only with DSC. Okay. So I'm guessing Nintendo did not want to muck around too much with DSC, unlike Sony. Sony's already gone the DSC road. Muck around, yeah, exactly. Very technical. They did not want to mess with that. And so
Yeah.
unlike Sony, they've decided to not go down the DSC route. So probably that's ultimately a good thing, because I actually don't think 4K 120 support is important for Switch 2. Obviously 8K 60 support is kind of a bit farcical for a device like a Switch 2. And 4K 120 should scale well to 1440p 120. It's also possible perhaps they could have gone down to a more aggressive level of chroma subsampling, which is actually what Sony does with their 120 hertz mode at 4K. Nintendo is facing some of the same constraints here, in the sense that I think they only have effectively 25 gigabits per second of bandwidth from DisplayPort 1.4. So it seems like the choice is basically to either have a compromised version of 4K 120 or not to support it at all. And that's what Nintendo seems to have done. My actual only concern here comes down to display modes. Like if I'm running the system at 4K 60, which is how I imagine most of the time I'll be running the system, and I load up Cyberpunk, which apparently has a 40 FPS mode of some variety in there, am I going to be able to see that mode? And if so, will the system be able to switch into that mode and drop to 1440p 120? So is it like the PS5 basically, which could do that, right? Or is it more like the Xbox, where you kind of set a global resolution and a global refresh rate, and all the content just kind of works within that container? So I guess that's the question here, because normally the latter approach would be fine enough, but it's really that issue where we have this mismatch between the maximum resolution at a lower refresh rate and a lower resolution at a much higher refresh rate. So I'd hope that all visual modes could be made available, and if they could integrate that in a way that would actually work out pretty well for people who do want to have that choice in some titles between your 120 FPS modes and your 60 FPS modes or your 30 FPS modes. That would be really, really nice to see. And it would also be really nice to see, as is the common practice, if they downscale, you know, your 4K 60 mode in Metroid Prime 4, for instance, to 1080p 60 if you have an appropriate display. If they're going to be doing that like all the other console manufacturers seem to have settled on as a standard, that would be quite nice.
Yeah. I mean, 4K 120 would be massive overkill for the Switch 2, but at the same time, it's just the convenience of just being able to set the resolution, set the refresh rate, and things will just work. I guess that's kind of like what we're looking at here. I guess you don't really have a huge amount of input on this one, Alex.
No, not really.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move on. It's another question from Source here. The newest FPS Locker 2.2.0 beta on a modded Switch showcased that running at full clocks, Switch 1 can do tons of games even at 120 FPS. Is it time for Nintendo to unlock some of that potential? Yeah, just at the right point where you're releasing a more powerful sequel. Maybe a dock mode, performance mode with higher clocks as a way for developers to target cross-platform releases, or maybe dock mode only games like they did with 2D only games in the latter part of the 3DS life. I mean, this is a lovely conceit, isn't it, Oliver? The concept. I mean, there is a lot of overclocking headroom on the, I think it's the Marico switches in particular, the second generation versions. It's a lovely idea just to, you know, have like an overclocking option built in, then it just works. But every time we've talked about this being an option for a new Switch model, it never happens. And now we've got Switch 2 happening. So the concept of a more performance Switch in any way, even as a software unlock, it's a nice dream to have, but it's not going to happen, is it, realistically?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to kind of like take the 10,000 foot view and think, what is a console, right, with these questions? Because with a console, you're really giving up a lot of customizability over like clock speeds and things like this. Usually that's not exposed to the end user. But fundamentally here, Nintendo makes choices to balance battery life, performance, and ease of development for games. There aren't too many hardware configurations. And they've standardized the Switch around a number of relatively modest CPU and GPU clock speeds for portable mode and docked mode. And it doesn't make sense for Nintendo to disrupt those standards willy-nilly, unless I could see there being a situation where something's radically changed in the kinds of games that people are bringing to Switch. But as far as I'm concerned, like the Switch has always had big issues with like PS4 era software, issues that will hopefully be resolved on Switch 2, but it's definitely had those issues for a while. If you go back to 2019, 2020, you can see a lot of games with big substantial issues on the original Switch unit. Those issues have existed for a long time. They're not new issues, and I don't think anything's really changed radically to compel Nintendo's hand on this and cause them to break the glass and break out the fire extinguisher and say, we need to push the CPU clock to 1.78 gigahertz. I don't think that's quite happened. And for Nintendo's first-party stuff, which is also what they care about a lot, that's generally been fine. I don't think they've had any issues there. So yeah, just in general, like, I think Nintendo, they've balanced battery life, they've balanced performance, they've already made those considerations. I don't think they want to break that just as this generation is ending. I don't think they have a really compelling reason to do so. The third parties that can't run games on Switch 1 have mostly given up on it, and I'm sure are working on Switch 2 titles. And the first-party studios working with Nintendo that still have to release games on the Switch, hopefully those will mostly be okay. I say mostly because there is an upcoming Pokemon game, so I can't guarantee that, obviously, but hopefully they'll mostly be okay.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of these situations where it's going to be down to the modding community using hacked switches to do this kind of thing. I think the other thing, of course, is that if you do want higher performance for your Switch 1 games, Nintendo has a product for you, and potentially it's Switch 2. We can talk about that, actually. That was that was kind of like a bit of a problem, wasn't it, this week, where Nintendo basically saying, well, if Switch 2 is too, was it the price point that was the issue?
It is a price point.
Yeah. If Switch 2 is too expensive for you, don't worry, we've got a product for you. It's called Switch 1. It's very much reminiscent of the whole Dan Matvick Xbox 360, Xbox One thing from back in the day. Yeah, I think it's sometimes that execs just don't really read the room.
No, I mean, if people are frustrated about some sort of price point, you should probably explain why the price point the way it is, rather than giving them sort of like fake alternatives. It's not, Switch 1 isn't a Switch 2. Like, what's the point? Yeah,
which they already own. Yeah. Most likely. That's just totally nuts. Okay, let's move on to our final question, and this one comes from Jim Jam 707. A quick Switch 2 question. I mean, it's been Switch 2 questions pretty much wall to wall for the last couple of weeks. Anyway, has it been confirmed how handheld mode will handle unupgraded Switch 1 games yet? Best case would likely be running the game in its dock mode to get a 1080p image out to match the screen. Worst case, a NAF upscaling filter. Well, Oliver, again, this is an interesting conceit that I can't really see happening, but I think actually makes a lot of sense. Conceivably, you've got, Nvidia is saying that the Switch 2 GPU is 10 times faster than the Switch 1. I mean, it isn't, but it is considerably more performant. In theory, it could be done, right? You could run docked mode Switch 1 games in handheld mode on Switch 2, right?
Yeah. I imagine you could do this, but there are some issues with some games, at least. Like if you have touchscreen functionality in some titles, right?
Yeah.
Those titles would need to run in their portable mode configuration on Switch 2 in portable mode. That could be a problem. I could also imagine they'd have a concern with battery life there. Obviously, they're talking about getting their Switch 2 backwards compatibility into a good state of battery life. Hopefully, it ends up more towards the top end of that range of Switch 2 battery life figures rather than the bottom end of that range. And they did seem concerned with that, so that could be a factor. And then also, you got to consider here with Switch 1 software, there could be a trade-off possibly between forcing this better image quality through docked play and having better performance in some titles. Like there are very many Switch 1 titles that fail to reach a consistent 60 FPS, a consistent 30 FPS. If you throw a bit more clock speed at the problem, and if you have those games running in their handheld configuration on Switch 2, you could probably get them into a pretty decent spot there. So I think those would be the prime factors here. And it does not seem very Nintendo-like. That's my kind of third reason. It does not feel very Nintendo-like.
It doesn't feel very Nintendo-like. And I think the bottom line is that games running in handheld mode should still see performance boosts on Switch 2, even if it stays in handheld mode, in theory, if we're getting that extra horsepower deployed at it. It's just that you will be seeing in almost all scenarios a top-end resolution limit in DRS games of like 720p rather than whatever it may be for the docked version. But I can see a reason, there is a good use case here, because obviously when you've got a native 1080p display and you've got a massive library of games, many of which, were targeting 1080p, kind of makes sense to me. I guess, as you say, Oliver, there would be battery life considerations. It could well be the case that the handheld clocks would not be compatible with the kind of docked clocks of the last generation for various reasons. Kind of think, based on what they've described, though, using their translation layer, that it probably would work. I am kind of amused by Jim Jam 707's alternative worst case, a NAF upscaling filter.
Yeah,
could well be what we're getting, right?
I think that's probably what we're going to get, actually, based upon what Sony did with the PlayStation 5 Pro with the it's not NAF. I'd say Oliver looked at it and it's better than what you would expect. It's better than just a bilinear upscale potentially. But with Switch 2, there's potential that it could be just more than a normal bilinear bicubic upscale given the hardware. But I guess that's something you're going to have to wait and see until we get a really good in-depth hands-on with a backwards compatibility title that has yet to get an upgrade. Or an optional upgrade or whatever. So I'm very curious to see what Nintendo does, because if it was just 720p and 1080p on that screen, potentially wouldn't look so good, actually. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, they could also do something like a little bit more fancy. Like if you go back to the PlayStation Vita, that had an integer scaling mode and I think a bilinear mode, and you could toggle between them for PSP titles. Also, obviously, there's the Steam Deck, which you can do like a bilinear upscale. You can do FSR1, obviously, with a different range of like sharpnesses and things like that. There's some potential for that, although I would argue that's not a very console-like approach, perhaps. That term console-like, not very console-like, not very Nintendo either. But yeah, at a stretch, if they were able to engineer some performant machine learning based upscaling like we seem to see on PS5 Pro with its enhanced image quality mode for PS4 software, that would certainly be quite compelling. But again, if performance was there, I'm not too sure, because on PS5 Pro, that was quite a performance sapping feature, actually, even with its machine learning hardware. But in general, I think just as a general matter here, if you can keep your OG Switch hardware, especially if you have an OLED unit, I think you should, because primarily for the pixel match for that display, again, we don't know if the Switch 2 might run games in dock mode. Providing it doesn't, there's not going to be that pixel match, unless they offer like a pixel match mode, in which case the games will be much smaller than the display itself. That will probably not be such a good experience. And also because if you do have an OLED model, that OLED screen is probably going to be superior in a lot of content to the Switch 2's LCD, I suspect, especially in games with a lot of dark content. And then also you get perfect backwards compatibility, or perfect compatibility, I should say, not backwards compatibility. And you can load games onto a regular micro SD card there, which you cannot actually do on Switch 2, even if you're only loading Switch 1 games. So a number of advantages possibly to keeping around your original Switch unit to enjoy the Switch 1 games. That's certainly what I will personally be doing. But yeah, that would be my general suggestion.
My thoughts on this, my final thoughts are interesting. I think that if it is possible to run the 1080p docked versions in handheld mode on Switch 2, well, first of all, the games that you're talking about with like touchscreen support, they could be whitelisted to not support, blacklisted to not support that. And I actually think if you're looking to get people to upgrade from Switch 1 to Switch 2, and you're looking to get the most out of, because this is going to be the key thing, right? Getting people to move across from one generation to the next. I think they should be considering things like this. Right? I think it's a really good idea. I think the reason we're probably discounting it is that historically Nintendo has not been so progressive in terms of these types of features. It's quite a conservative company overall. But, why not think outside the box? Because, there's a lot of reasons in the short term why a lot of people may well be sticking with Switch 1, primarily the price, right? So to give as much value as possible, assuming it's even technologically viable, I think it's well worth considering. But, guess we need to wait and see. Anyway, that was the final question, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you and potential algorithmic boosts for us. But as always, a DF supporter program, please do check that out. Early access to a ton of stuff. Early access to DF Direct Weekly, the chance to help shape the show. weekly updates from the team, bonus materials. There's a lot going on there, so please do consider supporting the team there. It makes a huge difference. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching, supporting Digital Foundry, and I guess we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.